This podcast is the design of City Sites Urban Media, and our goal is to bring into focus the difference between culture and God's ideas found in His Word. To learn more, go to citysitesurbanmedia.com.
Statistics have shown that 1 in 4 people will suffer with a mental ill health issue in any given year. Over the past 25 years, anxiety and depression in teenagers has risen by 70%.
Adam didn't believe that he was going to get better, and he could give you, and you could look on his Facebook wall, the list of treatments and medications that he's tried over the years, and they failed him.
We came to realize that every time we had a conversation with him, it might be our last.
There's a lot of pressure these days to be a real man. My dad would have called me a sissy if he'd known how weak I feel sometimes.
I had a great boyfriend, great friends. It's like depression always loves to choose the most perfect time to kind of come in and shake up your life. Next thing I knew, it was a month or 2 of me not leaving my bed, me starting to cut, blacking out, literally my mind going blank and not knowing what happened.
I remember thinking early on, how could this amazing, spirited young woman go from fully alive to dead? I began reading everything I could, just trying to understand it. But why is there so much stigma attached to mental illness when it's not? There's no stigma to have other diseases like cancer. It's not unusual to hear people with mental illness described as weak, lazy, violent, unmotivated. And conversely, people battling cancer are described as strong, brave, determined, and courageous.
This is the City Sites Podcast with Larry Kutzler.
I have had the opportunity in my ministerial life to minister to people with mental illness. It takes time, patience, and a great degree of trusting God for help as you wade into the waters of mental illness. I am no expert on mental illness, but being around enough people who suffer from it, I have observed a few things that may be helpful. Number 1, mental illness, like any illness that affects the physical body, is just that, an illness. People get sick with physical ailments while others get sick emotionally and mentally. Number 2, there is no easy cure, and it usually will take a long time to sort through the symptoms. Number 3, some mental illness may be incurable, and so there are stages of how to prepare and care for someone who will never get better. Number 4, mental illness can create a crisis of faith in some caregivers, since God is capable of changing anything. So why doesn't He act on behalf of my loved one? This is not an easy topic to cover because there are so many unanswered questions, especially if the mental illness ends up tragically in a suicide. Yet, I thought I would talk to some who have had members of their family who experienced mental illness and how faith interacted with the conditions that they faced. Before I get to my guests, let me give you a few thoughts from the National Institute of Mental Health. In 2015, 17.9% of all Americans 18 years and older suffered from mental illness, and 9.8 million, or 4%, suffered from a serious mental illness. Mental illness is a significant cause for suicide, which is the 10th leading cause of death. And finally, according to the Center for Disease Control, 78% of adults with mental health symptoms agreed that treatment can help persons with mental illness lead normal lives. My 2 guests today are Jim Hansen, who's an author, a teacher, and an executive director of a nonprofit, and Kim Phillips, a home health worker. Both have survived the loss of a loved one due to suicide. Jim also has written a book about his experiences, and we'll reference that later in the podcast. Jim, thanks for being with us. Tell us a little bit about your story.
My wife, about 16 years ago, was diagnosed with clinical depression. That came about after a family doctor did a blood test and found out in the morning that her blood alcohol was 0.06. And so he had some concerns and suggested that she go see a counselor. And she did, and she was diagnosed at that point in time with clinical depression. about a month later, she attempted suicide for the first of 5 different times throughout the process. She was in and out of treatment facilities to get out of the alcohol. Finally got out of that about 6 years before her death. But after she got out of her alcohol situation, she turned to other destructive behaviors. She cut to so-called relieve the pain, which is still an oddity to me. She struggled with an eating disorder, was in and out of facilities. But for the last 8.5 years of her life, Laura was taken to a hospital or a treatment facility 19 different times and spent probably close to a year in those kinds of facilities.
Now, Jim, was this the very first time that you've had any involvement with somebody with these kinds of issues?
Yes, it was.
So you're looking at this. What is your emotional temperature like?
Confused, unsure, scared.
So did you wake up in the middle of the night sometimes or in the morning and wonder if, especially she's gone through these 5 attempts. Did you ever wake up and wonder what is going to go on today? Was there this anticipation? How did you handle that?
Every day.
Every day?
Every day. Every day as I went off to work, I would wonder whether I would see my wife again that night. And the only way I could handle that was to just, to the best of my ability, turn it over to God and let Him comfort me and strengthen me and deal with that. Ultimately, I started a support group in my church for husbands, or I should say men, who had somebody in their family who was suffering from mental illness. And we did men only because I believe that men and women are both vulnerable in these kinds of states. And so to have a mixed group could certainly lead to other things that shouldn't be occurring in a Christian household.
Along with Jim today, we have Kim Phillips. Kim, you also had an experience with mental illness in your family. Tell us a little bit about what was going on in your home.
So I have a son named Daniel, and he was dealing with some reactionary type of depression on top of ADHD that he got diagnosed with when he was in about 7th grade. But at the time of my son's depression, grief, reaction, he was 17, and he lost his cousin and my nephew, and also, a typical high schooler. And he ended up taking his own life right after he turned 18, right before he graduated. So we lost a son by suicide 3 years ago.
So, Kim, as you were processing all of this during the time that your son was experiencing this depression, the loss of his cousin, what were you thinking? What was going through your head and emotions at that time? Was it apparent to you that this could have turned into something more serious with your son?
I had no idea that he was that depressed. How did we feel? I was scared, for sure. I was worried. His friends were worried. There were times, we had some family counseling. And we offered counseling to all of our kids. And I was going to counseling after my nephew died. And so, there were times, I had the suicide hotline actually on my phone because I worried that his mental health was not in a good place. His friends at the time in high school were trying to know where he was at all times besides us, and they were connecting with us through texting even, where's Danny? How is Danny today? There was a few months there that everyone was very worried.
Seems that both of your stories of your loved ones, there was a lot of things that you were doing for them, yet it didn't seem like it mattered, right?
I would say for me, it didn't seem to matter. Laura would go to the doctor and get her prescriptions, and she'd take them for a while, and then she decided that, ultimately, as she told me, she decided that I didn't deserve to feel better, and therefore she stopped taking her medication. And after she stopped taking her medications were the times in which she attempted her suicide. But hid that from me that she was not taking her medications.
Well, I think that's part of it too, right? The mental illness is, maybe it's shame-based in some way, and people just don't let others, especially close loved ones, know what's going on. Obviously, Kim, you had no clue. You knew something, right, but you didn't know how depressed your son really was.
I didn't realize how deep the ache and the pain was to him. Later, he did leave us a letter, and we do realize that he was using singing. He said when he would sing, he was in choir, and he always loved worship. His friends at camp that he would go to retreats with or camps with would always say Danny would get in his zone, and he would have his hands raised, and he loved worshiping. But he also, liked popular music and was in show choir. He did say that singing was one way that he was trying to cope, but I think that he felt like nobody was going to be able to help him. A counseling wouldn't have done any good, was his viewpoint.
And is that sort of the way that most people that have mental illness or experiencing mental illness feel, that they're beyond hope, that there isn't really any remedy, any pill, any counseling, anything that's going to help them get better?
I think that's true of those who are suicidal. I wouldn't necessarily think that's true of those that are just suffering from mental illness. I mean, you're talking about a really severe case of mental illness. In the case of my wife, we're not talking about just some minor type of depression type of a situation.
Let me ask you this then. Does even a mild case eventually grow? Does a person grow in mental illness and depression to the point where Laura was at?
Sometimes, but not all the time. Okay. And so you don't know, but my advice, having gone through this to people, would be take it seriously. Whether you think it is minor or major, take it seriously and do that. The other thing that Laura wanted her mental illness hid from everybody, to the point where I was instructed by her that I shouldn't share this with anybody. And ultimately I convinced her to let me start the men's group that I talked about. But I was never allowed to share with her family at all, anything, or with my family. And that's part of the reason why I formed the men's group, was because I was alone in this, and I couldn't cope with it by myself.
I think that my experience through the years, growing up in the church, I was also a pastor's daughter, so I have experience, being around a lot of people in the middle of their crises, and that many times things are very situational with depression or anxiety, and that people can go through difficult times and still come out and be fine. And even my own mother, dealt with bouts of some major depression in her life, but with both physical types of treatment, counseling types of treatment, just her own personal faith and walk with God, that she did not die because of her mental illness. She died of cancer last year. So God brought her through. She struggled with it, but she lived a wonderful, gracious life, love for God, and gave hope to other people, had compassion.
Which is what I would imagine both of you are doing today. You have a much more compassionate heart toward those that are struggling with mental illness. Before we get to the backside of how you coped and how things turned around for both of you, does it ever bother you that you don't have the answers that you wished you did?
Absolutely. There's always, why didn't I know? Why didn't I do this? I was praying, why didn't I have the perfect answer to know how to save Danny? I wish he was still here today, of course.
And I'm a little further along on the journey than Kim is. And so I've basically come to the knowledge of myself that, no, I'm not going to get all the answers to all the questions that I have. But I know who has the answers. And I'm just going to depend that his answers are right. That I'm going to depend on my Abba Father to know that the decisions and the questions that I have don't have the answers to, that he does, and that I'm not even sure ultimately when I get to heaven with Laura that I'm even going to ask those questions anymore.
Yeah, I agree. You might not need to answer any of those questions.
Yes, it'll be a different day, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Why are so many people wrestling with mental illness today, and particularly even in the church? You had alluded to even pastors going to the point of committing suicide. What's going on in our society today, and what does the church need to be doing?
We are bombarded with images like no other generation before us. From social media to 24-hour news cycles, we have images before us of decomposed bodies and murders and mysteries and killings and mayhem every day. Well, the Bible talks about without a vision the people perish. It depends on what you look at, whether you perish or whether you produce. And I think that we have released so much stress on ourselves. We have made ourselves available to more people than we ever have in the history of this planet. We have no privacy. We have no peace. We have no off switch. So all of a sudden, it's not only that you're bombarded with pressure, it's that you can't get away from it. And I think that's a real problem for people of faith and leaders and all types of people. We are just imploding. And I think what we can pray for is the still place, the calm place. He leadeth me beside still waters. And I think not only pray for, we need to practice having little Sabbaths, like the Bible said we should, and just get away from everything, shut everything down, cut the switch off so that you can find you. You found your followers, you found your friends, you found everything. Find you. And in quietness and confidence, the Bible said, shall be your strength.
It is amazing, however, that when there are a lot of mysteries in life, let's face it, we don't understand a lot of things. And that's why faith is so important, because science can't answer every question. It doesn't have the answers. And sometimes faith doesn't either. I mean, the church doesn't have a clear-cut understanding of mental illness, but they do have a message that kind of gets you through because you have faith in God. So let's transition over to that. Starting with you, Jim, how was your faith helpful when ultimately this tragedy took place in your life? What happened? How did it work out in your life and your faith?
Well, first of all, I'd say without my faith, I would have not been able to handle it at all. And I mean from the very beginning, not only to the point of which she successfully committed suicide, but from the very beginning of her mental illness, without God in my life and without His direction and without His comfort and without His care and without His love and without His righteousness and His holiness and His awesomeness, that there's no way I would have made it through this, I don't believe. I don't know if that meant I would have killed myself, but I certainly probably would have ended up leaving my wife, which I did not do and would not do, and would encourage anybody that was in my position not to leave their spouse, because they don't need you to leave them. They need you to be part of their lives. They can't do this on their own, and so they need your help. And I know that's not an easy thing to do, because it wasn't easy for me. But I'm thoroughly and completely convinced that that is one of the key things. If you're a spouse and you've got somebody struggling from mental illness and is suicidal, that you made a commitment to them when you stood up before God, and that was a covenant relationship commitment between you, God, and He. And when that subject came up with my wife, because she actually asked me at one point in time after she was in a therapy group, is, why are you still with me? And I had asked the question, well, why are you even asking that question? To me, it was obvious, but why I was still with her. But she said, well, it's because everybody else in my group, their spouse or significant others, have left them. And so I went back and I said, on February 9th, 1985, I stood before you and a bunch of our friends and relatives and promised you that I would be married to you from death to us part. And so you're just sick, so you're just stuck with me. And she actually giggled at that, which was a really good thing, because she's depressed and I haven't heard her giggle in a long time, right? And then I said, and secondly, probably, and more importantly, is that not only did I stand before our friends and family, but I stood before God. And I promised Him that I wouldn't leave you. And I was really more afraid of what He would do to me if I did. Well, that might not be good theology, but
I understand. Sure. No, it's your story, and it's how you have felt and how your journey led you. Kim, how about you? How was your faith helpful? Or, some people, I would think, would be mad at God simply because, God, why didn't you do something? You have the power to stop this person. Were you ever mad at God?
For sure, yeah. I mean, I think that's a normal response to just question, why do these bad things happen? I've faced that question before this. Why do bad things happen when you feel like you're trying to do the right things and live in relationship with God? And so trust has been probably my biggest hurdle. And I think it's still being worked on. by God at this time, is just trusting my God again, like I feel like I did before. And I think it was because we think if we do this, that there's some equation that then you deserve this in response from God. Protection or from that type of pain or loss. But you have to come to accept that that is not really our God. He's much bigger. His plans are greater. His redemption of things is not always understandable. But if we even look back at the Old Testament and people you study, like David's life, you'd say you don't even know what the outcomes can be until after you're dead. What God does to piece his plans together.
So both of you state that faith has helped you get through. Has it changed you in a way that makes you more sensitive to life than before? Is there any kind of softness now as you look at people or understand mental illness? Is there a softness or a empathy or something there for either one of you?
I think I have a greater empathy for people that are going through the situations and those types of things. However, become less tolerant of people that want to get divorced than I was beforehand, I think. And kind of go from a perspective, if you aren't going through what I was going through, then why are you even thinking about divorce?
You see divorce as a cheap way out.
As a cheap way out, yeah.
Okay.
And so I struggle sometimes with not being as sensitive in that area.
Yes, I would say that you're shown... Well, I would say at least my church showed us such compassion, such an outpouring of help and love and just being there, not just the first week, but the first year plus. And that was a beautiful spiritual thing that I was able to receive. Just one of many, I would say. It makes me want to be there for other people, even though I don't feel that strong yet. I don't feel like I still have a ton of margin in my life emotionally, and it's been 3 years, so it takes time. But I think it continues to come, and healing continues.
It continues, right?
My husband and I have this little Post-it note up on the mirror that says, "Pursue healing," in the bathroom, and it's a process.
You know, Jim, I'm going to come back to you because I opened a resource that you have written, which made me realize that you are much more sensitive to life based on the book that you wrote, entitled Hope Amid Hopelessness. Our Abba Father provides a straight path through mental illness. And it's just newly published. You just wrote this over the last year or two. But I opened the chapter that says, finally, at last, we hoped. And that's what this book is about. It's about a hope-filled opportunity that in the midst of the very darkest of mental illness situations, there's always hope. Tell us about the book.
Well, my friend Dan said to me about 2 months after Laura had committed suicide that, Jim, you really ought to write a book about it. And I go, yeah, well, I'm not a writer, so that ain't going to happen, and forgot all about it. A second friend of mine came up to me a couple of years later and suggested that I write a book on the subject, and I said, yeah, that ain't going to happen because I'm not a writer. But I did go home and write an outline for the book. And so I guess in a sense that maybe was a step closer to the process. And then July 27th, 2014, I was sitting in the chapel at Grace Church, Eden Prairie. And Pastor Troy was preaching on a sermon on Matthew 25, the story of the sheep and the goats. And I'm sitting in the chapel and I'm hearing from the Holy Spirit, I believe, that was saying to me, Jim, you have something my church needs, now go do it. So that afternoon I actually went home and started writing. That was about 4.5 years ago. The book's been written and rewritten about 5 times through the process, and think it's in a form now that is a good read.
Well, I've enjoyed it. I haven't quite finished it, but I have started it, and I've really enjoyed it. I love your story. You're writing it from a story standpoint, but you're bringing into the story the theology behind your journey and how the Lord was there and the scriptures were there and seemed to bring a lot of healing into your life. And you hear it as you read the book. So, Jim, I love the way that you've written. You've written it in a story form, and then you brought a lot of theology back into it. that you saw God as a friend, as somebody that brought you through all of this. So who would you recommend this for? Who should be reading it?
Even though it's a story about mental illness and dealing with somebody who's mentally ill, I think it's a good story for anybody who's in a caregiver position. Okay, if you're in a position of caregiving, you're struggling with the same kinds of questions that I struggled with. I know you are. And I certainly would recommend anybody that's dealing with mental illness in their family as being somebody that should read the book. And I do like to talk about it as God's story and not mine, because it's God's story working in my life. It's not my story with God working in it. It's the other way around. The theology and the scriptures and all that are in there because it's God's story. It's not mine.
The name of the book is Hope Amid Hopelessness. Where do they get it?
You can get it online at my website, which is hopeamidhopelessness.com. So real easy. Just remember the name of the book and go to my website, and there's a link there to purchase the book.
Okay, as we draw this to a conclusion today, both Kim and Jim, what were the greatest lessons you learned out of this journey with this loved one that was experiencing mental illness? Tell us one thing you took away that might help somebody today. Kim?
I would say that there is always hope. And, when we bury Danny, we have him under a columbarium that says the word hope on top. And the verses that we picked when we did a memorial bench were about hope, because it is in God that Daniel hoped. He did put his trust in God. And in his final letter to us, he said he wanted to be with Jesus. And I don't condone that as far as the suicide. I believe that the suicide itself is not God's plan. But I understand what Danny's heart was, that he loved Jesus, and he still had hope that that's where he was going, to be with him. And I think this book is such a real story of what Laura was facing. It's Jim writing it, but so much of it you can just feel what Laura was going through. And I love that in every chapter, as you get pieces of the story, it was how God was there and giving them scripture and truth, how to get through each moment as it came. It wasn't like it all falls down at once. Things come piece by piece. And if we look back, that we know that even in our healing process with grief, that God is giving us pieces and hope along the way, just when we need it.
I guess my strongest word of advice and encouragement in regards to this whole situation is that God is in control, even though you don't think he is. He truly is in control. And that ultimately whatever happens in our lives, it happens for a reason. And through this process, God has made me a better man. Would I have rather become a better man in a different way? Yeah, but I have become a better man because it's he that's in control of my life.
Well, I want to thank both Kim and Jim for being with us today. Thank you for sharing your hearts, and I hope our audience has taken something away that would be very meaningful and purposeful for them. Thanks again.
Thank you for joining us today. Every Friday we bring you this podcast with interviews with people who are challenging the status quo of Christianity and challenging the cultural norms of our day. Please help us get the word out by sharing the link to this podcast with your online friends and family. Our website also contains other podcasters who are a part of the City Sites network of communicators, all sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. Our website is citysitesurbanmedia.com.
This is the City Sites Podcast Network.